In a courthouse in Benton County, Oregon Territory in 1855, a black woman named Letitia Carson stood before an all-white, all-male jury and did something almost unthinkable. She sued a wealthy white landowner for stealing her life's work. And she won. This is the story of how a woman born into slavery became one of America's first black homesteaders, and how her fight for justice challenged everything Oregon wanted to be. The year was 1814, or maybe 1818. The exact date doesn't survive in any record, because enslaved people in Kentucky weren't considered important enough to document precisely. Somewhere in the bluegrass state, a girl was born into bondage, a girl who would be called Letitia. We don't know who her parents were. We don't know which plantation she was born on, or who claimed to own her. We don't know if she worked in the fields or in the house, though historians suspect she did both. The early decades of her life exist only as shadows, the way so many enslaved lives do. What we know is this. By 1845, Letitia had somehow made her way to Missouri, and her life was about to change forever. In Platte County, Missouri, a man named David Carson owned land. He'd been born in County Antrim, in what is now Northern Ireland, around 1800. He'd immigrated to America in the 1820s or 1830s, joining siblings who'd already settled in North Carolina. By 1839, he'd made his way to Missouri, and in 1840, he swore allegiance to the United States, pursuing citizenship. He received it in October 1844. He was 45 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts, he owned slaves. How Letitia came into David Carson's life remains one of history's unanswered questions. Did he purchase her? Inherit her? Was she already free when they met? The historical record stays silent on these crucial details. What we do know is that by September 1844, Letitia was living with David Carson, and she was pregnant with his child. In May 1845, David Carson made a decision that would reshape both their lives. He joined nearly 1,000 other emigrants preparing to travel the Oregon Trail, that 2,000-mile journey from Missouri to the Pacific Northwest. He brought 1 wagon, 1 cow, 8 oxen, 2 horses, 4 guns, 600 pounds of bacon, 600 pounds of flour, 3 white men and 1 woman. Letitia. The nature of their relationship at this moment remains unclear. Was she still enslaved to him? Had he freed her? Was she traveling as his property, his servant, his common-law wife? The ambiguity would follow them for years, becoming both a burden and, eventually, a strategy. What matters is this. They left Missouri together, and somewhere on that trail between the Missouri border and the Platte River, David Carson told Letitia that if she would live and work with him until his death, he would make her his sole heir. He would give her his entire property. It was a promise. It was not in writing. The Oregon Trail in 1845 was a journey into the unknown. Families packed everything they owned into wagons and walked 2,000 miles across prairies, over mountains, through territories where indigenous peoples watched this invasion with growing alarm. They forded rivers that could sweep away wagons and livestock in moments. They endured storms that turned the trail to mud for miles. They faced disease, accidents, and exhaustion. They buried children along the way, marking graves that would disappear under prairie grass within months. The journey typically took 5 to 6 months of constant travel, covering about 15 miles on a good day. Wagons broke down. Oxen died. Food supplies ran low, and every step west brought them deeper into land that had belonged to native peoples for thousands of years. Land that was being stolen even as the wagon wheels rolled across it. For Letitia, the journey had an added weight beyond the physical hardships everyone faced. She was pregnant, and she was black, and she was heading to a place that had just passed a law designed specifically to keep people like her out. She was traveling in a wagon train of nearly 1,000 people, most of whom probably supported Oregon's exclusion laws, most of whom believed that Oregon should be a white man's paradise. How did she move through those months of close quarters and shared camps? What did the people say to her, about her, when she wasn't there to hear? We don't know. What we know is that she kept going. In June 1844, Oregon's provisional government had enacted its first black exclusion law. It outlawed slavery, yes, but it also gave slave owners a 3-year grace period before they had to free their slaves or remove them from the territory. And any free black person who came to Oregon had a choice. Leave within 3 years if you were male, 2 years if you were female, or face punishment. The original penalty was 39 lashes, delivered publicly every 6 months until you left. Voters would rescind that particular cruelty before it was enforced, but the message was clear. Oregon didn't want slavery. It also didn't want black people. On June 9, 1845, somewhere along the North Fork of the Platte River, in what would become Nebraska, Letitia Carson went into labor. There, on the open prairie, with the wagon train paused and travelers gathered around, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Martha Jane. Think about that moment. A woman born into slavery in Kentucky, traveling across the continent with a white man whose exact relationship to her nobody can quite define, giving birth on the trail to a child who was half Irish, half African American, in a place that would someday be Nebraska. And not one person in that wagon train of nearly 1,000 people thought to write it down. Not one diary entry mentions the black woman who gave birth that day. It's only through later legal documents that we know it happened at all. This is how history treats people without power. It forgets them. The I. Carson family arrived in Oregon in the fall of 1845. In December, David trekked south into the mid-Willamette Valley and, under the Oregon Provisional Government's land laws, made a claim for 640 acres of mostly native prairie in the Soap Creek Valley. 640 acres was the amount entitled to married couples. Whether David and Letitia considered themselves married, whether they went through any kind of ceremony, whether they even wanted to be seen as married, we don't know. But David claimed the land as if they were. They likely built their homestead in the spring of 1846, close to Soap Creek. Building a homestead on the Oregon frontier meant starting from nothing. They would have needed to fell trees, split logs, construct a cabin. They needed to clear land for planting, breaking prairie sod that had never seen a plow. This was brutal work, the kind that left hands blistered and backs aching. They would have worked sunrise to sunset those first months, racing to get shelter built and crops in the ground before winter came again. They began raising cattle, and here's an important detail that comes through in the later court records. Letitia was the primary cattle raiser. This wasn't just helping out. This was her expertise, her work, her herd. She understood cattle. She knew how to breed them, raise them, keep them healthy through Oregon winters. When a neighbor later testified in court, he said David had told him explicitly that most of their 34 cattle belonged to Letitia, not to him. This matters because it shows that even in their partnership, even in the ambiguity of their relationship, there was recognition of her separate property, her separate labor, her separate skills. They raised hogs, which required different knowledge and different work. They planted crops, including potatoes, which were a reliable staple on the frontier. They likely established an orchard, planting fruit trees that would take years to mature but would eventually provide apples, pears, perhaps plums. The Applegate Trail ran close to their homestead, and this was a crucial economic advantage. It's probable that the Carsons sold produce, dairy products, and meat to travelers on the road. Imagine Letitia churning butter, making cheese, preparing food to sell to wagon trains passing through. This was income. This was connection to the broader economy. This was how you survived on the frontier. It was hard work, the kind of work that builds a life, the kind of work that should have secured a future. In 1849, Letitia gave birth to their second child, a son they named Adam Andrew Jackson Carson. By now, the family had been in Oregon for 4 years. They'd cleared land, built a home, established a farm. They were part of the community. Their neighbors knew them. And then, in 1850, everything changed. The United States Congress passed the Donation Land Claim Act, which formalized land ownership in Oregon Territory. The law was generous to white settlers. Married couples could claim up to 640 acres, single men up to 320. But there was a catch. Actually, there were several catches. First, the law only recognized legal marriages. Second, it explicitly excluded Black Americans from making land claims. David Carson couldn't claim 320 acres through Letitia, even if they were married, because Black people weren't eligible. And since interracial marriage wasn't illegal in Oregon at the time but also wasn't recognized, their relationship existed in a legal gray area. Oregon officials looked at the Carson claim and made a decision. They reduced it by half. The Carsons went from 640 acres to 320. In 1849, Oregon had passed another Black exclusion law. This one made it illegal for any Black person to enter or reside in the territory, except those who were already there. Letitia and her children fell under that exception. They could stay. But they existed on sufferance, at the margins of a society that had literally written into law that they didn't belong. The 1850 federal census lists the Carson family, David, Letitia, Martha, and Adam, living together in Benton, Oregon Territory. They continued to work their reduced land claim. They raised their children. They built a life in a place that didn't want them. On September 22, 1852, David Carson fell ill. It came on suddenly, the way these things sometimes did on the frontier. Within days, he was dead. He was 52 years old. He had not written a will. Remember that promise he'd made to Letitia on the Oregon Trail 7 years earlier? That if she lived and worked with him until his death, he'd make her his sole heir, that he'd give her his entire property. It wasn't in writing. Without a will, David Carson's estate went into probate, and the Benton County Probate Court needed to appoint someone to administer it. They chose a neighbor named Greenberry Smith. Smith and his family had also migrated to Oregon in 1845, so it's possible the Smiths and Carsons knew each other from the trail. Smith was a wealthy white landowner. He was tasked with making an inventory of Carson's property, selling it to settle any debts, and distributing what remained to the rightful beneficiaries. There was just one problem. Greenberry Smith didn't consider Letitia Carson and her children to be rightful beneficiaries. Either he saw her as Black and therefore ineligible to inherit property in Oregon, or he considered her to still be David's slave, which would make her property herself, not an heir. Either way, the result was the same. In January 1853, Greenberry Smith held an auction. He sold everything: half acres of potatoes, David's underwear, the family's Bible, bedding, dishes, tableware, jars, farm tools and equipment, 2 yokes of oxen, a wagon, a velvet vest, a watch, a clock, a gun, a thermometer, 35 cattle, 26 hogs, a 14-year-old horse. Everything the Carsons had built together over 7 years of back-breaking work in Oregon went on the auction block. The sale brought in $1,538.80. Letitia stood there and watched her life sold piece by piece. She had managed to keep hold of some money in her own name, $104.87, and she used every penny of it to buy back a few essentials: household goods, bedding, the marriage bed, a few cattle. It wasn't nearly enough. Letitia Carson, 38 years old, born into slavery, mother of 2, found herself suddenly homeless. She took her children, Martha, who was 7, and Adam, who was 3, and what little remained of her possessions: 2 cows and a calf, bedding, dishes, and she walked south, 160 miles south to Douglas County, to a place called Cow Creek. It must have felt like starting over, again. But Letitia Carson was not done fighting. On February 27, 1854, 16 months after David's death, Letitia Carson filed a complaint in Benton County Court. She sued Greenberry Smith and the estate of David Carson. Her argument was straightforward. If Smith and the court didn't recognize her as David Carson's legal heir, then she was owed back wages for 7.5 years of labor. She initially claimed $3,750 for her work, plus damages of $5,000. Later, she would reduce this to $1,000 for labor. She had representation from a Corvallis attorney named Andrew Thayer. Think about what this meant. A black woman in a territory that had laws on the books saying black people weren't supposed to be there at all was suing a wealthy white landowner. She was doing this in a court system where she couldn't vote, couldn't serve on a jury, couldn't hold office. She was doing this in a place where the prevailing attitude among white settlers was that Oregon should be consecrated to the use of white men and exclude black people entirely. Greenberry Smith hired a lawyer named John Kelsey, a notorious pro-slavery advocate and white supremacist. Kelsey's first move was to argue that Letitia had no legal standing to sue at all. When that didn't work, he shifted strategies. He argued that Letitia wasn't entitled to any wages because she'd performed all that work while she was still David Carson's slave. The case now hinged on a single question. What was Letitia Carson's legal status? Was she David's slave, his employee, his common-law wife, his heir? Both sides issued subpoenas to the Carsons' Soap Creek Valley neighbors and to people who'd traveled with them on the 1845 wagon train. Each was called to testify about whether Letitia was or was not David's slave. Unfortunately, the record of their testimonies wasn't saved. We don't know exactly what they said, but we know the result. The case went to trial in Nicea, October 1854. Judge George H. Williams presided. The jury deliberated, and when they reached their verdict, it was split. 9 jurors sided with Letitia. 3 sided with Smith. Because they couldn't reach a unanimous decision, Judge Williams ordered a retrial with a new jury. The case resumed in the spring of 1855. On May 7, 1855, 12 white men deliberated and then returned a unanimous verdict. They found in favor of Letitia Carson. She was awarded $300, representing her back wages, plus $222.20 in court fees. It wasn't the $1,000 she'd asked for. It wasn't anywhere near the value of what had been taken from her. But it was a victory. A black woman had sued a white man in Oregon Territory and won. The legal battle wasn't over. Letitia's claim for the illegal sale of her cattle hadn't been considered in that first judgment. In August 1855, Andrew Thayer filed a second lawsuit against Greenberry Smith. This case hinged on a different question: who actually owned the cattle? A neighbor named William Walker was deposed in October 1856. He testified that he'd gone to help David Carson in August 1852, a month before David died. While milking the cows, Walker had noted that David had a large herd. David told him that only 7 of their 34 cattle belonged to him. The rest, 27 head of cattle, were Letitia's. She'd raised them herself. On October 20th, 1856, the jury ruled in Letitia's favor. She was awarded $1,200. Letitia Carson had sued Greenberry Smith twice and won both times. It's hard to overstate how remarkable this was. This was a black woman in a territory with exclusion laws, facing an all-white, all-male jury, represented by a lawyer going up against a pro-slavery advocate, and she won. Twice. So why did she win? Historians have debated this question for years, because on the surface, everything was stacked against her. The jury was all white and all male. Many of them were likely neighbors, or at least acquaintances of Greenberry Smith. They were property owners themselves, men with their own land claims, men who had a vested interest in maintaining the social order. They lived in a territory that had explicitly written black exclusion into its laws, and yet they ruled for Letitia Carson. Part of it was timing. Letitia's victories came in 1855 and 1856 before the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which would declare that black people had no rights that white men were bound to respect. That decision would make it much harder for any black person to win a lawsuit against a white person anywhere in America. Letitia got her justice in the narrow window before that door slammed shut. Part of it was her legal strategy. By claiming she was David's employee rather than his widow or his property, she aligned her case with the free labor movement that was sweeping through the North and the frontier. Oregon. Settlers largely opposed slavery not on moral grounds but on economic ones. They believed that slavery and the presence of black people, enslaved or free, would disadvantage white workers and farmers. They wanted Oregon to be a place where white men could work and prosper without competing against enslaved labor or wealthy plantation owners. A ruling that denied a black woman payment for years of work would have set a dangerous precedent. If employers could claim that workers were actually slaves, and therefore owed nothing, where did that stop? Could white workers find themselves reclassified? Could wages be denied across the board? The jury may have ruled for Letitia not because they believed in racial equality, but because they believed in being paid for work. Her case exploited the contradiction at the heart of Oregon's free soil ideology. Part of it was that Letitia had earned respect in the community. This can't be overstated. She'd lived in Soap Creek Valley for 7 years. Her neighbors knew her. They had seen her work. They'd probably bought produce and dairy products from her. They'd watched her raise 2 children. When William Walker testified that David had told him most of the cattle belonged to Letitia, he was vouching for her. A white man was willing to take the stand and testify that a black woman owned property, that she'd earned it through her labor. That mattered. And part of it was that Letitia Carson was shrewd. She understood the legal and social landscape she was navigating, even though she couldn't read or write. She recognized that the ambiguity of her legal status could be used as a tool rather than just a burden. Was she David's slave, his employee, his wife, his heir? By refusing to let that question be settled definitively, by pivoting between identities depending on what the legal moment required, she exploited the cracks in Oregon's racial hierarchy. When it benefited her case, she was an employee owed wages. When it came time to file for the Homestead Act, she was a widow and head of household. She used the system's confusion about her status to her advantage, and it worked. But here's what the victories didn't give her. She didn't get the Soap Creek Valley homestead back. That land had been sold in 1857. She didn't get to return to the home she'd built with David, the orchards she'd planted, the life she'd created. She remained in Douglas County with her children. She worked, likely, as a domestic servant and a midwife. She sold dairy products from the cows she'd been able to recover. She kept going. And then, in 1862, something changed. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law. This federal law allowed any adult United States citizen to claim up to 160 acres of government land in the West. You had to live on it for 5 years, make improvements, and then it was yours. And here's what mattered. Unlike Oregon's Donation Land Claim Act, the Homestead Act didn't exclude people based on race. Black Americans could file claims. So could single women and widows. For the first time since she'd arrived in Oregon, Letitia Carson could own land in her own name. On June 17, 1863, Letitia Carson walked into the General Land Office in Roseburg, Oregon, and filed a Homestead Act claim for 154 acres on South Myrtle Creek in Douglas County. She signed the application with an X, noting it as her mark, which confirms she was illiterate, but also that she filed in person. In her affidavit, she stated that she was the head of a family, being a widow having children, and that she was a native citizen of the United States. Notice her choice of words. She called herself a widow, not a freed slave, not a former enslaved person. A widow. Whether she actually considered herself David's widow, whether there had been any kind of ceremony, or whether this was strategic language designed to ensure her children could inherit her land, we'll never know. What we know is that it worked. For the next 5 years, Letitia Carson worked that land. She cleared it, cultivated it, made the improvements required by the Homestead Act. She built a 2-story house, a barn, a smokehouse. She planted an orchard of over 100 fruit trees. She raised cattle and pigs. Neighbors testified in affidavits that she'd met all the requirements. On October 1, 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant certified Letitia Carson's claim. She became the only black woman in Oregon to successfully secure a Homestead Act claim. Her claim was one of the first 71 claims ever certified in the entire United States, out of what would eventually total 1.6 million claims. Some historians think her claim might have been as high as number 14. The 1870 census listed her as a landowner with real estate valued at $1,000 and personal property worth $625. Letitia Carson lived on that homestead for nearly 2 more decades. She raised her cattle, tended her orchard, worked her land. Her daughter Martha had given birth to a daughter of her own in 1864, a girl named Mary Alice Bingham, and then married a man named Narcisse Lavadeur in 1868. Narcisse's father was a retired Hudson's Bay Company employee, and his mother was Native American. Martha and Narcisse had 10 more children together. In 1886, Martha moved to the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Letitia's son Adam stayed closer, though records about his adult life are scarce. Letitia Carson died on February 2, 1888. She was 73 or 74 years old. She was buried in Stevens Cemetery in Myrtle Creek, Oregon, just a few miles from her homestead. And then, for over a century, her story disappeared. Letitia's name showed up exactly once in the media of her time. A brief mention in the Oregon Statesman announcing her case against Greenberry Smith. That's it. No newspapers covered her unprecedented victories. No history books mentioned the only black woman to successfully homestead in Oregon. Even her descendants knew few details about her life. The Soap Creek Valley land she'd worked with David passed from hand to hand. In 1941, the federal government purchased it for Camp Adair, a World War II training camp. After the war, in 1948, Oregon State University acquired 6,200 acres of the former Camp Adair lands, including most of the Carson property. It became part of what's now called the Dunn Forest. The land kept gaining value. Today, those 320 acres are worth approximately $1.17 million. Letitia's homestead in Douglas County, also gone from memory, though the creek that runs through it still bears her name. Letitia Creek flows from BLM-managed public land in southwest Oregon, about halfway between Crater Lake and the Pacific Ocean. The story might have vanished completely if not for an accident of research. In 1989, a graduate student named Bob Zybach was tracing the routes of explorer Jedediah Smith's 1828 travels in western Oregon. He was examining original land surveys and maps from the 1850s, looking for clues about where Smith might have traveled. An entry for North Benton County caught his eye. It was titled variously as Claim 44 or Estate of David Carson. Virtually every other claim in the territory was listed by the man, woman, or heirs of record. But this one was different. Why had this particular claim gone into a state of disputed ownership? Zybach was intrigued. He sent away to the Oregon State Archives for information. What arrived was nearly $30 worth of copies regarding a series of legal actions that had taken place between 1852 and 1857. When Zybach opened that file, he found something that hadn't been checked out since 1856. 180 documents detailing the Carson estate sale and Letitia's lawsuits. Every item she'd owned was listed. All the legal records were there. It was, as Zybach later said, like striking gold. For the next 3 decades, Bob Zybach and his research partner Janet Miranda worked to piece together Letitia Carson's story. They transcribed century-old cursive. They tracked down relatives. They located grave sites. They published articles and gave talks. Slowly, Letitia Carson's name began to resurface. Author Jane Kirkpatrick wrote a historical novel about her in 2014 called A Light in the Wilderness. Janet Miranda wrote another novel. Freedom's Light, the Letitia Carson story begins. Researchers created a digital history collection. Oregon Black Pioneers, the state's only historical society dedicated to the African American experience, began sharing her story through a traveling exhibit. In 2021, an elementary school in Corvallis was renamed Letitia Carson Elementary School. 4th graders now learn about a woman who'd been completely absent from Oregon history books when their grandparents went to school. In 2020, Oregon State University partnered with the Black Oregon Land Trust, Oregon Black Pioneers, and the Lynn Benton NAACP to launch the Letitia Carson Legacy Project. The goal is to preserve and honor her original homestead site in Soap Creek Valley, creating a place where people can connect with 19th century Black history in the actual location where it happened. There are plans for educational programs, for teaching regenerative agriculture, for welcoming students and families to learn Letitia's story on the land she once called home. It's a recognition that came more than a century too late, but it's a recognition nonetheless. So, what do we make of Letitia Carson's life? What does her story tell us about America, about Oregon, about the resilience required to survive in a place that legislated your non-existence? Start with this. Letitia Carson was born into a system that declared her property, that denied her humanity, that considered her 3/5 of a person at best. She escaped, or was freed from that system, we don't know which. She traveled 2,000 miles across a continent, giving birth on the trail, arriving in a territory that had just passed a law designed to whip black people out of existence. She built a farm. She raised cattle and children. She created a life. And when that life was stolen from her, when a white neighbor sold everything she'd worked for and left her homeless, she fought back in the only way available to her. She went to court. Think about the courage that required. Letitia couldn't read or write, but she found a lawyer willing to represent her. She stood in a courtroom full of white men who believed she had no place in their territory. She faced a pro-slavery lawyer who argued she was property, not a person. She endured a legal system that saw her as less than human, and she won. Not once, but twice. Those victories weren't just personal, they were political. Every time an all-white jury ruled in favor of a black woman, it exposed the contradictions in Oregon's racial hierarchy. If Letitia was property with no rights, how could she sue? If she was a non-citizen with no legal standing, how could she win? The very existence of those lawsuits challenged Oregon's claims about itself. The territory wanted to be free soil without free black people. It wanted the economic benefits of free labor without the actual people who had been freed. Letitia's cases revealed how impossible that position was to maintain legally, even if Oregon maintained it socially for another 70 years. And then there's the Homestead Act claim. When Lincoln signed that law in 1862, he opened a door that Oregon had tried to slam shut. Federal law superseded territorial law. Suddenly, Letitia Carson could own land in her own name, despite everything Oregon's Constitution said about black people and property. She filed her claim in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War, while the country was literally tearing itself apart over slavery and black citizenship. She worked that land for 5 years while Reconstruction tried and failed to remake the South. When President Grant certified her claim in 1869, it was a repudiation of everything Oregon's exclusion laws stood for. Here was a formerly enslaved black woman who owned 154 acres of Oregon land, free and clear. The state could write all the exclusion laws it wanted. Letitia Carson wasn't going anywhere. But let's also be clear about what this story isn't. It's not a story about Oregon's progressive racial attitudes. Oregon's black exclusion laws stayed in the state constitution until 1926. Interracial marriage remained illegal until the 1950s. Black people couldn't buy property in many Oregon neighborhoods until the 1960s. The state that Letitia Carson lived in spent a century trying to make itself white. And it's not a story about justice prevailing. Letitia won her lawsuits but was awarded a fraction of what was stolen from her. $300 for 7 years of labor? $1,200 for 27 head of cattle? Those weren't just verdicts, they were insults. She never got the Soap Creek Valley homestead back. She never recovered most of what Greenberry Smith sold. She spent the rest of her life rebuilding from scratch, and when she died, history forgot her for 100 years. This is a story about what it cost to survive as a black person in the American West. It's about the impossible choices people had to make. Use the ambiguity of your legal status as a tool, or watch everything be taken. Claim you're a widow when maybe you weren't legally married, or watch your children lose their inheritance. Work land that was stolen from indigenous peoples, or remain landless yourself. Survive in a system designed to exclude you, or disappear. Letitia Carson made those choices, and she survived, and she won victories that should have been impossible. But the fact that those victories were necessary in the first place is the real story. Letitia Carson lived 5 different lives, as historian Bob Zybach puts it. She was born enslaved. She was an Oregon Trail pioneer. She was a frontier farmer and skilled cattle raiser. She was a legal warrior who sued a wealthy white man twice and won. She was a homesteader who built a new life from nothing after losing everything. Each of those lives could fill a book. Each of those identities carried its own challenges, its own terrors, its own small triumphs. And for over a century, we collectively decided that none of it was worth remembering. That's not an accident. That's a choice. History is written by people with power, and Letitia Carson, as a formerly enslaved black woman, had neither the power nor the voice to write her own story into the record. It took a graduate student stumbling on an anomalous land claim in 1989 to bring her back. What we owe Letitia Carson now is not just recognition, but reckoning. We need to reckon with what it means that Oregon wrote black people out of its very conception of itself. We need to reckon with the fact that the Oregon Trail story we tell is overwhelmingly white when there were black people walking that trail, giving birth on it, surviving it. We need to reckon with the thousands of other Letitias who fought and survived and built lives in places that didn't want them, whose names we'll never know because nobody thought to write them down. 4th graders at Letitia Carson Elementary School are learning that history now. They're learning that a black woman could walk into an Oregon courthouse in 1855 and demand justice. They're learning that she could homestead land despite laws designed to prevent it. They're learning that resilience and courage came in forms their history books never taught. The land Letitia Carson worked still exists. You can stand in Soap Creek Valley today, on what's now Oregon State University property, and look at the same ground she saw when she arrived in 1845. You can visit Douglas County and see the hills she climbed when she started over in 1853. You can find Letitia Creek on a map and trace its path from the mountains to the valley. These are the physical markers of a life that almost disappeared. But the real legacy of Letitia Carson isn't measured in acres or legal victories, or even in the elementary school that bears her name. It's measured in the question she forces us to ask: how many other stories have we lost? How many other people fought impossible battles and won impossible victories, and then vanished from history because we didn't think their lives mattered enough to remember? How many Letitias are still waiting to be found in courthouse archives, in land claim records, in the margins of documents about white pioneers? Letitia Carson died in 1888 at age 73, on land she owned, free. That freedom came at a cost she should never have had to pay. It required courage she should never have needed. It demanded victories that should never have been necessary. But she won them anyway. She stood in a courthouse and said, "I am owed." She signed a homestead claim with an X and said, "This land is mine." She raised cattle and children and orchards and said, "I built this." And for 100 years we forgot her. The fact that we're remembering now, that 4th graders in Corvallis are learning her name, that researchers are excavating her homestead site, that a creek and a school bear her name, none of that erases what was lost. But it's a start. It's an acknowledgement that Letitia Carson mattered, that her life and her fights and her victories matter, that the history of Oregon and the American West is incomplete without her. She deserved better than she got. She deserved to keep the land she built with David Carson. She deserved full payment for her labor. She deserved to live in a state that didn't write her exclusion into its constitution. She deserved to be remembered while she was alive. But here's what she did get. She got her freedom, her land, her victories. She got to die on her own property, surrounded by the orchard she planted and the cattle she raised. She got to know that she'd fought the system and won, twice. And now, more than a century after her death, she's getting her story back. It's not justice, it never could be. But it's recognition. It's truth. It's the small victory of history finally admitting that Letitia Carson was here, that she mattered, that her impossible life and impossible courage deserve to be remembered. This is her story. Don't forget it again.